Welcome to The Long Game Talking Pensions, the podcast that brings fresh insight to the challenges and opportunities in retirement planning. In this episode, we're joined by David White from QB Partners to explore the evolving roles of SIPPs and QROPS in international pensions. From upcoming tax changes to cross-border planning opportunities, we'll unpack what advisors need to know in this fast-changing landscape. Let's find out.
Hello and welcome to The Long Game, a pensions podcast for international financial advisors. I'm your host, Rachel Meadows, Managing Director at IFGL Pensions, and I'm joined by my co-host, IFGL Pensions Technical Manager, Steve Berridge. We'll be popping into your playlist periodically to talk about topical issues in the world of pensions. This episode, we're joined by special guest David White, who works for pension cross-border planning specialist QB Partners, who are based on the Isle of Man. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, Steve. Thanks for asking me on to the podcast today.
Very welcome. So, David, tell us a little bit about QB Partners and the services you offer and what you do for IFGL Pensions.
Yeah, thank you. So, QB Partners offer financial advisors and product providers support with cross-border financial planning. So that includes pensions, as you said, also trust and estate planning. And we have a panel of international tax advisors, so we can help facilitate tax advice for financial advisors and product providers as well. I think for IFGL Pensions, your background for Steve and Rachel is quite UK pensions focused, but a lot of the supporting advisors are based outside of the UK and come across cross-border issues. So one, we can help in terms of a sounding board for Steve in particular when he wants a second opinion, when he wants to bounce something off somebody. But also I think we can help with our knowledge. We've been established for 16 years now of cross-border situations for advisors outside the UK who have clients outside the UK.
So today we're going to be discussing the different uses for SIPPs and QROPS. So both pension products available in the international space, but it's fair to say that they've each got different nuances, different pros and cons that advisors will need to weigh up when they're making recommendations to their clients. Steve, QROPS is a product which will be very well known to any of our advisors in the international space, perhaps less so for anyone dealing in the UK market. It's fair to say that tax changes over the years have removed some of its effectiveness. So where do you feel a QROPS still adds value compared with a UK SIPP?
That's a really good question, actually, Rachel. And obviously, with my IFGL hat on and my bias towards SIPPs, I'd be inclined to say that I would prefer the SIPP naturally, but I think it's fair to say there is still a place for QROPS in the sort of pension pantheon, as it were. I think if you're living abroad and you're in a country where there is a QROPS provider in your country, because that's important to know that you have to live in the same countries where your QROPS is based to avoid an overseas transfer charge. I think there can be a place for QROPS. I think it's fair to say that it enables people to invest more easily in the currency of the country they're living in and to invest in investments that are more locally based, and also to tap into local tax advice and financial advice in the country they're living in, which can assist with their QROPS product. We see, certainly in IFGL, there's certainly quite a thriving market for QROPS in Australia. I think that's probably because of the sort of peculiarities of the Australian market, where the tax relief system in a sense is turned on its head. So in the UK, obviously, we're used to people getting tax relief and contributions in and they get taxed on the way out. And it's sort of turned on its head a little bit in Australia. So we see quite a lot of business going through to Australian. These superannuation schemes are very popular over there. So I would say that is one market that seems to be still very popular. Being honest, haven't seen many in the European space in recent times, and that perhaps is just an inevitability of the countries that you can buy a QROPS in Europe, quite limited, sort of to the likes of Malta, Gibraltar, Isle of Man, and a lot of people more likely to live in places like Spain, France, or Portugal, so less opportunity to buy them. But yeah, there is still an opportunity, albeit that we have to say that some of the tax advantages that product came with at launch have sort of been removed as the years have progressed.
David, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think QROPS were designed for non-UK residents, and over the years there were some uses for UK residents, and that's being completely restricted now, so it wouldn't be appropriate for a UK resident. As Steve says, I think there are still some uses for Non-UK residents, depending on where you are, it can access local currency, can, depending on the jurisdiction, help with income tax mitigation as well. You can have more beneficial income tax treatments if somebody's winning the QROPS rather than the UK pension. And then one of the things I think we said we were going to discuss later on in the podcast was the forthcoming changes to pensions and IHT from April 2027. Certain circumstances, we believe that QROPS may have some advantages in that situation as well. So we'll talk about that a bit later.
And are there examples where someone might already have a QROPS, but they may wish to reassess whether that remains the most suitable product for them to stay in from a pensions perspective? Might a SIPP stack up better at this point?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, what happens when somebody moves back to the UK is if they've taken out QROPS when they're outside of the UK, they look at, and their advisors look at, transferring back into a UK SIPP, and that's the obvious thing to do. The international SIPPs, such as the IFGL SIPP, are very used to dealing with those sort of situations with advisors outside the UK and clients outside the UK, and there's situations where a client's moving back to the UK. So that's the obvious thing to do. Think again with that forthcoming change to pensions and IHT, I just sort of caveat that in that there perhaps should be care when somebody is not defined as a non-UK long-term resident. If they have a QROPS, which is a non-UK asset, then that could provide some advantages. And I think, again, we're going to unpack that a little bit later on in the podcast.
And it really comes back, I guess, to the theme in a lot of the conversations that we have around underlining the real need and value for financial advice when clients are making these decisions, because they're not straightforward at all, are they? There's lots and lots of different factors to take into account.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to get more complicated, doesn't it, over the years? Pensions simplification was brought in a long time ago, and that made things more complicated, and it just seems to get more and more complicated as time goes on. So, yeah, clients definitely need financial advice on all of these things.
Yeah, I think next year we see the 20-year anniversary of pension simplification, do we? So, yeah, not really a simplified landscape. One of the perhaps more surprising announcements given last year was the removal of the overseas transfer charge exemption in the EEA of Gibraltar. David, tell me a bit more about this.
What wasn't a surprise, I don't think, was the removal of the exemption in respect of UK residents, and that was removed as well as EEA and Gibraltar in the October budget last year. And to be honest, we'd expected that to happen after Brexit, because whilst the UK was part of Europe, then it made sense for the European exemptions to apply to the UK. It didn't change after Brexit, and so that part of it in the budget wasn't a surprise. As you say, the removal of the exemption for Gibraltar and particularly European residents was more of a surprise. And that's really where the exemption was before, was there aren't QROPS in all the different European countries, but there are QROPS in jurisdictions such as Malta and Gibraltar. And what was happening prior to last October was that if an individual transferred from a UK pension to a Malta QROPS and was resident in France, for example, Spain, Portugal, there was no overseas transfer charge. And that's what's been removed, that exemption for an EEA resident to move to an EEA QROPS. The reason that HMRC gave for the removal was the fact that both QROPS and a UK pension can have a lump sum allowance under the new post-lifetime allowance rules. So in theory, if somebody has a QROPS and a UK pension, they can access a lump sum allowance from the QROPS and from the UK pension. There was a famous headline in our world, famous anyway, and I think the Telegraph, which was double bubble tax-free cash. And clearly HMRC didn't like that and wanted to remove that possibility going forwards. That's why, that was the reason given. If you look at the overseas transfer charge exemption regulations, that was the reason given for removing those exemptions.
Steve, I know budget rabbits from hats are very topical for you at the moment, and you'll be watching in a couple of weeks' time to see what on earth is in store this time.
Yeah, it seems like a little bit of Groundhog Day bearing in mind it was only sort of 11 months ago we were sat here, the first budget, wondering what rabbit she was going to put out of the hat. And there was an awful lot of speculation at the time about the tax-free cash sum being removed, and we saw people rushing to take lump sums out of pensions. In the event she didn't do that, and I think it's been the same against this year. People sort of worried about the tax-free cash sum, and only today I read a headline in a trade journal sort of suggesting that she's done a U-turn on that one and she won't be removing it. So difficult for people at the moment to really make concrete plans, and for advisors, I can imagine it's quite a difficult job to us trying to steer the clients into maybe calm waters. I guess the important message really to maybe give to people is that it's probably look before you leap. So, don't take action in haste based on what might happen. Maybe wait until we see what does happen. Obviously, the tax-free cash sum is can be a nice tidy sum for people. Not always in everyone's best interest to take it. So again, the advisor's well placed to help steer you through those sort of waters. If you're thinking about taking a tax-free cash sum, it might not be the end of the world if it's removed. Tap the relief on contributions. That's another one that sort of gets every 2 or 3 years. We told they might relieve the higher rates of relief. Same again this time. I'm not really sure. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
David, we understand that IORPS may be used to avoid the residency clause and therefore avoid the 25% transfer charge. I guess firstly, can you bust the acronym IORPS? Hey, we're an industry of acronyms, but tell us more about it and whether you think this can be appropriate at times, and what are the pitfalls that people might want to be aware of?
Yeah, so the acronym stands for the Institute of Occupational Retirement Provision, and it's an EU acronym across European pension schemes. The reason we thought it would be of interest to advisors in the podcast, watching the podcast, was because some of the Malta providers have started promoting this as a potential solution following the overseas transfer charge exemptions, because an IORPS can qualify to QROPS as well. So a Malta pension scheme can run through the IORPS rules and qualify under the IORPS rules, and then can also qualify as a QROPS. And because it's an occupational pension, it meets one of the other exemptions of the overseas transfer charge. So the two main exemptions that are left to the overseas transfer charge are what I call same country, which Steve referred to before, which is when an Australian resident transfers to an Australian QROPS, there's no overseas transfer charge. And the other one is a transfer to an occupational pension scheme. And this was originally intended for individuals who might work for multinational companies who had offices in different countries around the world. And if that individual was transferred with their job to another country and transferred their pension to a pension in that country, which qualified as a QROPS, there's no overseas transfer charge. Now, what's happening with IORPS is that they are being looked at as a potential exemption because they are an occupational pension and do qualify as an occupational pension. But we're a little bit concerned that they should only be used in the correct circumstances. And what I mean by that is that there has to be a genuine occupational pension. And we think that HMRC, when they're looking at whether the exemption was given correctly to the overseas transfer charge, will look at that pension and say, for this individual, is this a genuine occupational pension? So where we think they may have genuine uses is it's similar to a SaaS type situation in UK speak. If somebody has a small company, they're perhaps an entrepreneur, and they have a small occupational pension scheme, then they could establish an occupational pension scheme in Malta. They should start, we think, contributions to that pension scheme. And then if they transfer their UK pension into that occupational pension scheme, then that is legitimate planning. It's seen as a genuine occupational pension scheme. It was established prior to the transfer of the UK pension, and it should be deemed as an occupational pension and then be granted the exemption to the overseas transfer charge. So we think it could be useful planning in the right circumstances, but again, clients need to take financial advice, and financial advisors should just take care to make sure that they believe it's an occupational pension scheme, and don't be afraid to challenge the client who might have heard about this thing want to do it, but it might not be the right thing for them.
That's the real danger, isn't it, when these rumours come around, is if you haven't got the genuine link, and which in the right circumstances is relatively easy to evidence. You can demonstrate your employment link, payslips, business records, whatever it might be. But if you're looking at it as something to navigate and exploit, it's a really short-term planning tactic. Okay, back to budgets, big news, but thankfully the last budget again. So the big news at the last autumn budget was the announcement that discretionary pension schemes will, from April 2027, be subject to inheritance tax. They'll be included in someone's estate when they die in the vast majority of circumstances. There is some debate about whether this will include QROPS, which by definition, as you alluded to earlier, David, are based overseas. What are each of your thoughts on this?
Okay, so it does include QROPS. So what the regulations say is that both UK registered pensions and QNUPs, which is an acronym for qualifying non-UK pension schemes, will be deemed as within the estate subject to IHT from April 2027. QNUPs is an umbrella acronym for overseas pension schemes, which includes QROPS. So QROPS will be included. There isn't any debate over that. There's a couple of things that are being debated, though. One is, first of all, how will HMRC make this work for QROPS? It's much more difficult to make this work. There's been a lot of challenge, as you know, to these proposed regulations. We believe that they're going to happen, but there's a lot of challenge as to how the government, the Treasury and HMRC intend to make them work. And that's the case for UK pensions, but it's exacerbated for QROPS because they're an overseas pension and typically the client's based overseas. So how are HMRC going to make sure that the correct amount of IHT is collected? It's going to be more difficult by definition. And the second point is one which again is being debated as to whether QROPS will be deemed as being within the estate for a non-UK long-term resident, because QROPS is a non-UK asset, as you said, Rachel. So we believe that for somebody who's a non-UK long-term resident, in certain circumstances, QROPS as a non-UK asset will be outside of the estate. If somebody's a UK resident and they have a QROPS, then that's going to be within their estate. That's not open to debate, I don't think.
And the other recent big change, which impacts our international clients and is linked to the conversation that we're having, is the removal of the non-dom regime and introduction of this long-term residency test. So I guess when our overseas advisor listeners are thinking about this, what do they need to be aware of? What are the key points they need to think of with the long-term residency test?
I mean, from my point of view, I think one thing that they have to be aware of is that there is a sort of tail. So someone is a UK resident and they leave the UK, they sort of UK residency sort of goes with them for a number of years. Advisors will have to be quite on the ball with this in sort of trying to calculate how many years the client has been a UK resident, how many years have they been an overseas resident, and are they still caught as a UK long-term resident or a non-UK long-term resident. So that's one of the important things I think they need to look into. 10 years is the amount of time that qualifies you in the UK as a long-term resident. If you've been a UK long-term resident for 10 years, I understand if you leave the UK, it takes up to 10 years for you to lose that status. If you correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think it was down depending on how many years you've been in the UK before you leave. So it's one of the important points. I think in principle, I sort of welcome it because I think the non-dom regime was quite a complicated concept, really, domicility, because obviously it's quite easy to work out if you're a UK resident or not. It's usually based on the number of days you are in the UK, and there's various other tests that can establish that. But I believe originally that domicility was based on the nationality of your father. I think if you go back, I'm not sure if I'm still correct, but it was. And then so people could move to another country, live there 15 years, and they might think that they're sort of a UK domicile, but in fact they were still domiciled in the country that they were born in. So this is sort of, in a way, it's removing some of that greyness. So it's much more black and white now, which I personally welcome. But it would just be easy to get caught out if you just return to the UK. And I suppose this will also tap into our discussion about QROPS as well, for people who've return to the UK that have a QROPS, and David's recent comments about inheritance tax and pensions. So all things that need to be borne in mind by advisors. So they've got two big ones there really to try and grapple with concurrently. They changed the IHT and also this removal of non-dom regime.
There is a big link between the two, isn't there, Steve? And
Yeah.
Just picking on what you said there about the 10 years. So I think it's easy to assume that after 10 years, I'm going to be okay and I don't have to worry, and I'm a non-UK long-term resident. As you said, care has to be taken over that. And what we're recommending to advisors is that they have the client take some UK tax advice using the statutory residence test as a test. So the statutory residence test was primarily income tax related until this new regime of long-term residence came into view. But it's very easy when you're outside of the UK to still fall under the UK from a statutory residence perspective. If you spend a lot of time in the UK, you may still have family in the UK, you may have children at university in the UK and you spend a lot of time there. You may still have property in the UK. So these links under they're called ties under the statutory residence test. If there's too many of these ties under the statutory residence test, somebody might think that they are non-UK long-term resident, but actually my parents were ill and I spent a year in the UK 5 years ago. Does their clock start ticking 5 years later than they thought it did? So there's lots of things that need to be looked into, and that we think the most appropriate advice is take some tax advice on statutory residence for anyone who's unsure about that. And then the other thing, linking back to QROPS, that's interesting is the 10-year tail that Steve referred to, or the tail once you leave the UK. That also applies for people coming back to the UK as well. So if somebody has been deemed non-UK long-term resident because they've spent a lot of time outside of the UK, when they come back to the UK, there's 10 years before they're deemed UK resident or UK long-term resident under the tax rules. So going back to the question as to, I think there was a question before about if somebody is outside of the UK and has a QROPS but moves back to the UK, should they move back to a SIPP? And this is perhaps an example where you shouldn't rush to transfer back into a SIPP, because a QROPS could have advantages in those circumstances. If somebody's still deemed non-UK long-term resident and has a QROPS, which is a non-UK asset, then that could be outside of their estate under the new rules from April 2027.
It's going to be lots of work for advisors, I think, over the coming years, isn't there?
A good time for tax advisors.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
Financial advisors and tax advisors, and always lawyers. Lawyers always do well, don't they?
And I think that's without having a plug. That's where QB partners can benefit a lot of advisors, because we have a lot of tax expertise within the business. We're not tax advisors ourselves, but just from our backgrounds, as with Steve and yourself, Rachel, we know a lot about the tax treatment of pensions and other planning structures. And we also have access to this international panel of tax advisors that we've built up over 16 years. So we're able to help with the tax advice in different jurisdictions and facilitate tax advice to the client through our panel of tax advisors.
So the new legislation is still at the draft stage, but what would be your thoughts on non-UK long-term residents using QROPS to invest in UK underlying assets?
So where this comes into place is that if you transfer from a UK pension into a QROPS, but then invest back into underlying UK assets, have you really transferred the benefit outside of the UK? So when we've looked at the legislation for pensions and IHT, looks through the pension. So that's our interpretation anyway. It talks about the benefit under the pension in the detail of the legislation rather than the pension itself. So we think there's going to be a look through to the underlying assets. So the reason I said, there's two reasons why I said that a non-UK long-term resident with a QROPS, that QROPS would be outside of the UK state. One is that hasn't been confirmed yet, but we believe that's logical. And the two is, for the maybe, is that if the QROPS then invests into UK underlying assets, then we think there'd be a look through and it would be then within the estate. So if a non-UK long-term resident has a QROPS which invests into non-UK assets, then we believe that that's a non-UK long-term resident with a non-UK asset. Only if they are a UK long-term resident do worldwide assets come into the estate. So it's a non-UK asset for a non-UK long-term resident. But if they then invest into UK underlying assets, they're moving, if you follow the money, they're moving the money back into the UK. So then does it become the UK asset, we believe. So hopefully I've explained that properly. And clearly it is a little bit convoluted, as a lot of these things are, but hopefully that was clear.
Certainly was. And I think what else is clear is we could talk about this for hours, but let's bring this to a close with a top takeaway from each of you. I think my top takeaway is going to be the absolute need for financial advisors here to play a very active role with their customers. Steve, what's your top takeaway?
I think in terms of the subject matter of QROPS, I think my takeaway would be that there still is a place for QROPS. However, with all of the changes to taxation that have come and are coming, and more than ever, it's a time to get expert advice before you leap, because it's become more of a grey area now in terms of whether it's a good option for you or not, and it'll all be very specific to each individual person and the number of years they've lived in the UK or abroad, or their precise circumstances. So definitely talk to an advisor.
It's not beneficial. It's normally cheaper, isn't it, as well? David, what's your top takeaway?
Yeah, I think there's a reason that HMRC were given 2 years to implement the pensions and IHC rules. Some of the England governments decided that this would be a good way to raise additional taxes, and it probably is a good way to raise additional taxes, but they perhaps didn't look through the detail of how it was going to be made to work. And there's been some big challenges, as I've said, to that point, really, not to the fact that it's happening, but to how are you going to make that work. So, and there's still lots of unanswered questions. So I think the takeaway is watch this space, don't do anything drastic, and as you said, take advice.
Brilliant. David, thanks so much for being an excellent guest. I really enjoyed the conversation. It's been very interesting. Hopefully those listening find it interesting as well. Thank you for listening. We look forward to talking to you again soon in the next episode of The Long Game, a pension podcast for international financial advisors.
Thanks for listening to The Long Game, Talking Pensions, brought to you by IFGL Pensions. If you found this episode useful, please follow or subscribe so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more insightful conversations coming your way.